everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. Jay is a football-loving, raw onions-hating dad whose passion is to help others. Described by others as thoughtful, Jay identifies as an ethnic, racial, and religious minority on the autism spectrum with a cognitive disability. As a learning consultant with the ultimate career aspiration to solve inequities in organizations, Jay applies his curiosity and people connecting superpowers every day. Welcome, Jay.
Wow, thanks for that welcome. I had to look over my shoulder there for a second. Figure out who you were.
Who's she talking about?
Who is she introducing? But thank you so much, Dr. Liz. I definitely appreciate that.
Well, that is certainly you. Now, you mentioned to me offline that others would be surprised to know that you identify as having two disabilities. Why do you think that is?
I've done a pretty good job of masking both of those. But as we continue to talk, you see I may tend to stare off a little bit. Maintaining eye contact have been an issue there as far as being on the autism spectrum. So that's one of them. And I typically don't like to spell when someone is watching. That the dyslexia kicks in. Words like form and from gets me every time.
Okay. Well, thank goodness for, spell check and Grammarly. But unfortunately, when the words actually are actual words, then we actually still get caught out.
Yeah, those two words get caught quite frequently. Form and from, they're spelled correctly. So if you receive an email from me, form me, right? That might happen every once in a while.
So I'm really thrilled that you've joined us today. And when every guest agrees to participate in an episode, I send them a questionnaire. And there is a huge long list, something like 54 identities to tick from. And you ticked 7. What were they for you?
So 7, for me, two of the things people see automatically, they see that I'm Black and I'm a male. Two of the things we mentioned earlier, my cognitive disabilities is in terms of the autism spectrum and those things there as well. As far as religious, I was actually raised in a church. So when I was younger, I had a lot of very strong beliefs as far as religion. Those are no longer the case as I've gotten older. So those things happen. Being a Black male, a racial minority, is a part of that as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm a parent. I have a little one. She's over here in the corner. So we try to work as we navigate this new normal with the young ones at home while working. So there's some of the things I identify as.
Having 7 different identities means there's a whole lot of intersectionality going on. But what I want to do is I actually want to start talking through how each of those identities play out for you, and then we'll just keep layering them and see where this conversation takes us.
Actually, it's one I didn't think about that most people don't know as well.
Yes.
That I'm an immigrant. I was in the U.S. Yeah.
As am I. Well, how about we start with that? Where did you immigrate?
Yeah. Jamaica.
Jamaica. How old were you?
Yeah, I think we moved here. I was 7.
Okay. And so your parents moved there?
Parents moved to Miami. I grew up in Miami. That's home. But the part of it is being in the U.S., if you're Black or white, you're considered a real American. So no one ever really asked me where I'm really from. So even though I'm an immigrant, it kind of, that's one of your privilege, right?
Yeah.
Being that skin color in this country.
Well, you certainly do have an American accent, whereas I certainly don't. So people would assume
I've been here long enough.
Well, tell me then, moving from Jamaica, was English your parents' first language?
Yes. Okay. It was English with a Jamaican accent, but English.
And do they tend to be well received into Florida, for instance?
Yeah. So in Florida, there's a huge Caribbean presence, and it's cool to be Jamaican at the time with reggae and Bob Marley, and so it's pretty cool, as opposed to friends of mine who were Haitian weren't really welcomed as Jamaicans were in Miami. So that's a privilege there I was able to experience growing up as a child. I saw that pretty early.
You've told me offline that you're in Atlanta.
Right.
What's the experience for you like in Atlanta, talking about your racial identity?
Well, Atlanta has a huge African American population, so I fit in. I guess I don't have to try as hard
Mhm.
um, as some people have. It caters to people who are African American, identify as African American or Black here in Atlanta. So it
Yeah.
was an easy transition for me to move to this city and just assimilate and just be myself.
You
Right.
said African American or Black or African American, right? And
Right.
there's a lot of assumptions made around if you are Black in America, you're African American. Now,
Right.
you've already just shared with us that you're from Jamaica. So how does it impact you when someone assumes you identify as African American?
Yeah, I just correct them, and even with friends of mine who are born here in the U.S. that don't identify as African American,
Mhm.
identify as Black. Even though this whole racial thing is a construct, right? But still, I choose to identify because that's what you see as far as skin color. So that's how I identify. I choose to identify as Black.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Now,
Absolutely.
this is a curious question, and I don't have the answer. So I'm really genuinely curious. The oppression and experience for African Americans through slavery and the process of getting to the US, and the evolution of their experience in North America. Does that apply to you?
So my history is a little bit different. In Jamaica, we weren't. They tell the entire history. So they start off with the native inhabitants who are the Arawak Indians.
Mm.
So that's how our history begins in Jamaica. It's not about like here in the U.S. The history for Black people start with the slave trade.
Mm.
Our history starts with the or began rather with the original inhabitants, and to tell that history, they also tell the good, bad, and the ugly. I was able to be in a place where the people who were leaders, the people who represented the country, looked like me.
Mm.
That was a big difference. So I had that growing up to see people that looked exactly like me in government, the leaders, community leaders. That's what I saw. So that was normal for me to see that. And as a result, it wasn't too far fetched to be in those positions.
Do you think your parents had any much of a culture shock when they moved into the US?
Probably did, but there's a huge Caribbean, as I mentioned, Liz, footprint in Miami, including Jamaicans that are there as well, and a lot of the Caribbean countries will kind of like make our own city. So does my friends who identify as Hispanic. They make their own little groups there as well. So it's welcoming. It is indeed a melting pot of different cultures,
Mhm.
and I was very fortunate to grow up in that environment.
Okay, so you said that you grew up in the church and you inferred that things have changed for you over time. Can you share with us what that means for you?
Yeah, so I grew up, Dr. Liz, going to church probably, I think, 5 days a week. It seemed like I was in the choir. We had a choir rehearsal. It was youth fellowship. It was Sunday school. Then it was church. Then it was the Sunday. It was a lot of church there. But I had questions as a child, and they couldn't answer in Sunday school. So I had questions then as a child. We would talk about, the Adam and Eve, and I was like, well, what happened to where are the dinosaurs? We have proof that they exist. And I was like a 5 or 6 year old. And it's just as I evolved, one of the things that I really had an issue with was I was taught to treat people who were identified as LGBTQ as different. I was initially taught that these people would go to hell. And as I got older, I met people who identify as LGBTQ. I didn't believe that. And so if that's wrong, what else is wrong?
Mm.
So I questioned a lot about what I've heard as a at the time Christian that I just didn't believe in. That I conducted more research as far as people with my skin color weren't traditionally Christians. If I if I was being fed a lot of misinformation, what else was not 100% accurate?
Mm. I think there's a couple of things going on there. And where do we take
A
this? Which
couple of
rabbit hole?
layers there.
Which rabbit hole do we
It's a
choose?
couple. Have fun.
I wonder, when we look at your intersectionality and the layers of your identities, if part of your questioning that you talked about is related to autism spectrum and looking for the logic and questioning until you found the answer. Do you think that played a role?
I think that plays a major, major role. It has to make sense to me. I believe in patterns. I literally see patterns in people. I see patterns in processes. And if this doesn't make sense, then I'm like, I'm not sold. You have to prove to me that this thing works.
Mhm.
So I haven't really thought about it until you just mentioned it, but it makes perfect sense that that has a key component in my thought process.
But what a superpower that you can see these patterns, that you can question and look for truths.
So yes, and I'm constantly pulled into meetings to assess a lot of gap analysis where there's a system that's not working. Jay, take a look at this, and I will go through like, well, we haven't done this step, and I could just identify it. And I've realized that even though people refer to it as a disability, to my point, it's a superpower.
Mm,
Another one's incredible focus. If I decide to get focused and complete a task, I could like literally tune out everything and just focus
mm,
on one task and get it done. So
yeah.
I view them as superpowers as well.
Absolutely, it can play out as a superpower. Are there some ways that perhaps being on spectrum might have formed as some barriers or things that you've had to work around?
Yes. One, as I mentioned earlier, it's when I typically facilitated in in-person setting, it's a lot easier to walk around the room, and I would always make eye contact with someone. It's a little more challenging for me especially one person on camera. So I
Mm-hmm.
tend to look to the left quite a bit. So I try to catch myself and refocus.
Mm,
And so I'm intentionally positioning myself to where I am now. So I have to look to the left to begin with. So if I
yeah.
look away, I'm still looking in your direction. That's one piece. The other piece is I could oftentimes overanalyze a process and literally go down that rabbit hole. I'm like way down there, way, way down the rabbit hole. And I have to like really catch myself. People who know me well, who have worked with me, I said, let me know when I'm going too far. Like, Jay, you need to pull back.
Yeah.
So I've had some teammates who are aware how I've worked over the years, and they're very comfortable pulling me back when I'm down that rabbit hole.
So you said if someone has worked with you for a long time, they know this about you. But if they don't already, do you sort of self-disclose and say, look, this is how I work. If you see this happening,
Yeah, I try to be open and transparent with my fellow colleagues and let them know up front. I try to just share because we have to work together. So here are my strengths without saying what it is
mhm,
until I'm comfortable. Because oftentimes, some people may like, oh, so you or have a disability, so there's something wrong with you, right? So I depends on how I feel. I may or may not disclose right away, but
mhm.
I'll share how I
Good.
work best. Yes, absolutely.
Because I actually don't subscribe to the idea that you should have to say why.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
do not. Yeah.
So you can say, look, this is how I operate best. This is how you might see me demonstrate my behaviors. This is how you can pull me up. These are the needs, blah, 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 blah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there's times where I'm with a coworker, I'm like, "How are you?" And like, "No, how are you doing?"
Yeah.
I could just tell they're off. Sometimes we're on the phone, I could hear their voice, and it's just by their tone, it's different. I can just feel their energy,
Mm,
and they're like, "How do you know?" I'm like, "It's just something that's off about your pattern.
mm,
Normally, you would say good morning, or this morning you skip good morning this time. So
mm.
there's something there."
Now, what a beautiful way to articulate the skill, the emotional intelligence skill of people on spectrum. Now, I want to highlight this point because so many stereotypes and assumptions are made that people on spectrum don't don't know how to express emotions or don't know how to read other people's emotions, and that is not true. So you've actually highlighted how you pick up on other people's emotions. It's a slightly different way to someone else might. You're looking
Right.
for changes in patterns of behavior, and then
Mhm.
you know something's off, so you know to check in on them to see how they are. So I think that's a fabulous way to highlight how you see the emotion and then respond to it.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Patterns. It's like the world is a roadmap.
I'm jealous. I want a roadmap.
It's a beautiful thing, and I have a very good friend of mine. We all see the same things. We talk about the patterns and how we and you can't see that. Like we you just it's obvious. So we
Hmm.
finally understand that not everyone can see patterns in nature or in processes or in people. And we've realized that it's something pretty special that we have.
It really is. It really is. Why is there such thing as neurotypical? Why can't we just all be neurodiverse? Why do we have to pigeonhole people to say, well, that means you're dysfunctional or not typical? Anyway, it's something that if we can get to a place where we don't use labels to negative or box people and actually start to go, you know what, everyone's diverse in their ways of thinking, therefore everyone
We're
is
all different.
neurodiverse.
I think we all are, Dr. Liz. It's just some people do a really good job of, like myself, of hiding it. We all have, there's something there where we all think differently, because there's people that are neurotypical, as you would say. I would talk to them like, how could you not see that? Like, what's wrong with you? It's so obvious. And it's not so obvious because we have these various strengths, right? So we're all different.
Yeah, totally. How did your evolving belief in faith and the church affect relationships in your family?
To this point, it haven't. I haven't told a lot of people how I really feel. And my wife knows. We have the conversations. My best friend knows. And it's been an evolution, right? So a lot of my friends or family are very, very religious. And if they say let's pray, I'll bow my head. It's not a big deal.
So if you're socializing in circles with people that have a faith that excludes other people, right? So
Like
you gave us,
Christians?
well, yeah, look, in your example you shared with us that they don't believe that people that are gay or queer, well, they actually think they're going to hell. And if you don't believe that, but people are playing that out in conversation around you, what happens for you? Like, what's going on?
So I think I do a really good job of choosing when to respond. Not every interaction deserves a response. And after me conducting my assessment of this individual, is it even worth having a conversation with them? And there's some people believe what they believe in based on their biases, conscious and unconscious. They're not going to change. They won't even try to see the other side of the other coin, right? So at that point, is it even worth having a conversation with them? So I choose not to. Those who are more open, I have the conversation with them, because I have friends of mine who are Buddhists, people who are Muslim, people who are atheists. I'm like, so what about these people? Is Will your God save them as well? Because they're also humans, right? So we have those conversations, go with pretty in-depth conversations. But as I stated earlier, if they're unable to have the conversation logically, then I just opt not to. I let them just talk.
Hypothetical situation. I am of a faith that believes LGBTQI people are going to hell, and I'm in a conversation with you, and for whatever reason, I already know that you don't feel the same way.
Right.
How do I include you in the conversation? How do I meet your needs?
That's a really, really good question. And if that person strongly believes that, I don't know if they want to include me. And that's why we do this work, right? You can educate individuals, and I try my best to educate people. That's what I do quite a bit. We have the conversations, the tough ones, people who are not like me. For the most part, most of the folks I speak to are a lot of white men in the U.S., blue collar white men, and they share their stance and beliefs. I'm like, I understand. I try to really understand where they're coming from. A lot of times it makes sense to me. It makes sense where they're coming from and why they feel the way they do. And I'm like, good, hold on to that. This group of people feel the exact same way you're feeling. It's just that they're different. And you're thinking my needs are important, theirs are not. And they're thinking the same thing.
How about we look at everybody has needs?
We all have needs. We all do.
Yeah.
We all do.
Now, I want to go back a bit. So when I pose that hypothetical to you, I struggle because religion is that one identity that we choose. And I know we get born into things, but as fully functioning adults, you get to then choose.
Yeah.
Let's keep going with the hypothetical. If I have a faith that excludes others, I have an expectation that those around me will include me and respect my beliefs.
Right.
Is it fair that I don't respect yours?
That's what I struggle with.
Mm.
Because I'm respectful of other people and their religion. That's because that's your belief. That's your core moral and values. You believe this stuff, and I respect that. To your point, if I can respect you, why can't you respect me?
Mm.
And I try to point that out to other individuals. It's we all, to your point, we all want the same thing,
Mm.
to belong, to be loved and respected, and that's all we want.
And there's actually room for all of us to thrive. That's the point.
More than enough
We
room.
don't have to give up our needs for someone else to have their needs met.
It's more than enough room.
Yeah.
More than enough.
Like you said, when people have beliefs, it's not inclusive for us to expect we can change their beliefs. So I'm not saying that in doing inclusion work means that we have to go around to everyone that has a religious
Absolutely.
faith and say, you're not allowed to have those beliefs anymore, because that's actually not inclusive in itself.
Correct.
But when we're creating inclusive organizations, let's say, or inclusive cultures, whether that's in the community, in schools, education systems, healthcare systems, you must have an inclusive experience for everyone in that space. So I guess when I'm talking to others about navigating religion in the context of inclusion, it is, I am not changing you and your beliefs. When you enter into this space, you're expected to demonstrate inclusive behaviors. What would those inclusive behaviors look like for you? What makes you feel like you're included and you can thrive?
I'm a little different, Dr. Liz. And the reason being, knowing I have certain privilege and I do as a straight, straight male. I'm athletic. I'm educated. I check a lot of these boxes, right? So I don't feel the need to fit in your box.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't fit in your, I could go somewhere. I make my own damn box. I'm sorry, yeah, my own box. That's the way I feel. So most of what I do, I advocate for other individuals because I'm going to be okay. I don't have to be included in what you have going on there. I don't have to be a part of that.
Yeah.
I find myself advocating for the LGBTQ community. I find myself advocating for women, people who people might identify as Hispanic or Asian. I find myself advocating for those who don't have a voice. I at one point I was just supportive, being an ally,
Mm-hmm.
but I find myself more shifting to advocacy where I'm speaking up, and I don't
Yeah.
care who feels uncomfortable. It's just we have to do the right thing.
Brilliant. And anyone that's been in any of my keynotes, they will know I talk about privilege in it.
Yeah.
And you brought it up just then. A lot of people think that privilege is just one, you either have it or you don't, right? And if you're listening and you're not watching the video of this podcast, Jay just made like a confounded face. But what you really highlighted for us is the concept of privilege means we all have different privileges. So if we just take ourselves as examples, right? You have the privilege of being male
Right.
in our dynamic here, right? So if we were walking in the dark at night, you certainly have a privilege over me because you probably feel a lot safer than I do, right?
Absolutely.
But then if we flip the tables for a second, depending on what environment we're in, of course, my white presenting is a privilege point that I can use in favor to advocate for you. So we all have these privilege points that we can use to advocate for others. What's the difference for you between being an ally and being an advocate?
Let's say you're on the stage performing, an ally, I'll probably show up to show my support
Mm-hmm.
that Liz is performing. If I'm an advocate, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to clap and let everyone see I'm cheering for you. Like I'm Team Liz. Might even wear Team Liz on the back of my shirt.
I
Right.
might
They
make
know
some.
that. Right. Yeah. And so that I want you to know that I'm with this individual, not only silently supporting them, but outwardly supporting them. and I'm going to be a voice for them as well.
If we talk about change management in organizations, right? So take out inclusion for a moment.
Right.
Change management, if you are active and visible in your sponsorship of the change, that's an important leadership behavior and action.
Mm-hmm.
That's what advocacy is. You're active and visible in influencing the change of inclusion.
Absolutely.
I just want to highlight that for everybody, because we talk about allyship and there's so much training around being an ally. I actually think it's not enough.
The one thing I would say, it's for some, it's a lot. If you
Okay.
weren't an ally to begin with, then that's
It's
the
a
next
step.
step.
It's a
Right.
step.
It's similar to, I think a couple of years ago, a lot of people were posting those black squares to support Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
And some folks were saying, well, that's not enough. Well, for a white person that has a wide audience and white friends who are very conservative, for them, that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's a good
For the
point.
person to post that black square, knowing what's going to happen afterwards, a big deal for them.
Yeah.
Right. Just the first step for and I've spoke to white people who, once they posted that black square, they got it.
Oh my gosh, you made a really interesting point. So I hadn't looked at it that way. So that's a fantastic learning for me. When I launched the podcast a couple of weeks ago, the first episode I launched was African American identifying transgender male. And I lost followers on LinkedIn. Now, that's fine. I won't take it personally, but I can see what happens when you're authentic and true to inclusion. Not everybody likes that.
They like the fluff, the feel good stuff.
Yes, they just like the cupcakes and celebrations
Yeah.
on International Women's
That's
Day.
it. Yeah, that's it.
Has there been a time when you have felt really excluded, that you actually just felt like a duck out of water?
I have.
What was it? Where was it? What did it sound like, feel like, taste like?
The irony, and this is where we talk about race sometimes not being an issue. It was actually with a group of primarily Black people that I felt excluded. When people think about diversity, they don't think about how we think. And the way I think is different from a lot of other people. And the way I grew up was different. As I shared with you, I grew up in the Caribbean. So my perspective is a little bit different from a lot of folks who may have been born in the US. One time in particular really was the most recent. It was within a group of my colleagues. And I believe a big part of it was the autism spectrum, where you would make a statement, and for me to process, I may have to repeat it to really process the statement. And the response was, I just said that. And I'm thinking, I know, I'm trying to process this. So I really understand the ask. But that was the one time I felt recently the most excluded, where people actually looked like me, that treated me as if I was different. Including one of the individuals actually had a visible disability and an invisible disability. And he also was along with the group as well. But he had no idea I had a disability. And I chose not to share that with him.
Why didn't you share it?
After I did my assessment of the individual, he didn't care. It wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have mattered. So I just opted not to. The one person in the group I felt like would have understood, I shared with her, and we're talking on the phone. I could hear the pause in her voice. I started explaining to her. I gave her a snapshot of some of the traits of someone who's autistic. I said, "What have you seen me display?" And she's like, "Oh my God." She's going on a list of the traits. I'm like, just about all of those, right? And I said, that's just me, a snapshot. It's a part of me.
So it's interesting. I mean, you kind of described the room, right? And there were people with disability, either visible or invisible.
Right.
But there was a group think that happened, right? People remained quiet. So let me pose to you the last question I'll have for you today. What's one thing that you would suggest to people in a room that noticed someone being called out for their difference or sort of blocked for their difference? What could I have done to advocate for you in that room?
It's a lot that could have happened. The person who led the charge was actually the leader. and she made it okay for them to respond that way. Because there's times where, and I think about patterns, she would say something and kind of sit back and wait for them to laugh. I'm like, this is what we're doing. So I had a conversation. I'm like, okay, this is where we're going with this. So I had a conversation with her afterward. I said, this is, in our small team, is the one place I feel the most uncomfortable. I feel disconnected. In the bigger groups where there are other individuals, I feel at home there. I said, this is the space that you have created. And I was honest with her. And it didn't feel good, but well, for her, but it had to be said.
It's an interesting dynamic when it's the leader or the most senior person in
Yeah.
the room that's demonstrating the excluding behaviors. It makes it tough for people to have that courage to advocate. Now, Jay, what is it that you do in this world?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking, Dr. Liz. One of the things I think is important in this world is the educational piece, to have the conversation. So I decided last year to launch my consultant firm, Lightburn Solutions. And as a group, we decide we're not a consultant firm, we provide solutions. As of now, we're focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings.
I want to thank you so much for your time today, Jay. We're going to put all of your contact details in the podcast description so people can get in contact with you and work with you.
I definitely appreciate you having me today.
No problems at all. It's been a joy. Thank you.
It's been a joy. Thank you.